Hello, welcome to episode 61 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. And this is John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life with Ken Womack. I'll get to that in a second, just a couple of other things. There's no guitar lesson this week, but I would like to alert you to a podcast called Kinks and Beats Daily. That in fact, I was alerted to by loyal listener Paul Killingley, who was on the Listeners Speak episode 53 from memory. As it suggests, it is a daily podcast where he alternates between Kinks songs and Beatles songs, and he's also a guitarist and he busts out the guitar and shows you some interesting chord sequences and the like. It's a good podcast. There's lots of different types of podcasts. Obviously there's ones that can go up to 6-7 hours, which wouldn't be so frequent. Then you've got the daily podcast, which is 15-20 minutes, something like that, so recommended. What I wanted to share with you today was some Beatles coincidences. Sure, I've remarked on this show, or maybe it was on other shows, sort of half-jokingly I've remarked that perhaps the whole Beatles story was preordained. There's someone up there directing all this. And there could well be, because there are lots and lots of coincidences, and they're far more than I actually made a note of in preparation for this. I had already got some notes, because most of the ones I'm going to tell you about actually come from Mark Lewisohn's Tune-In book. What happened was that back in 2014, the early months of that year, I downloaded the extended edition of Tune-In, which was 1,700 pages, I think. And I thought to myself that I'm probably unlikely to ever read this twice, although I'll happily read the commercial version, which is a mere 900 pages. So doing this for the one and only time, much like with the Nagra reels, you want to make the most of it. So I decided pretty early on that I was going to make notes. And I made extensive notes while I was reading, and it was a wonderful 3-month journey. That's Tune-In, by the way, not the Nagra reels. And one of the things was that I noticed that Mark pointed out these coincidences, so I ended up making a list of them and putting a file on my computer. So most of these are from Tune-In, but I've added another couple. So here we go. Paul McCartney was born on the same day as an advert for a new musical review called Thumbs Up, which is now his trademark gesture to fans. So Ringo does the peace sign and Paul generally does the thumbs up, and occasionally the peace sign. The first house Paul ever lived in was in Anfield, near the football stadium. The family living next door were called Lennon. John Lennon had an ancestor who was a priest, Father William Lennon, who was given an award by the Pope of the time for organising a bazaar in Liverpool in 1900, 60-odd years before Bigger Than Jesus. When he died in 1921, his obituary in the Liverpool Catholic Herald was on the same page as an advert for Epstein's furniture store. By the way, I've called these coincidences, curiosities and connections. You know, although Liverpool is a fairly big city, it's not a huge coincidence that things connected with the Beatles might appear on the same page of a newspaper. But anyway, this one you may already know about. Paul's dad bought a piano from the store owned by Brian's dad years before the Beatles and Brian met. George Martin was taught oboe by Jane Asher's mother at the Asher House in Great Portland Street. Something about that later. Heartbreak Hotel, the song that changed many lives, including John Lennon's, topped the Liverpool charts in 1956, beating out competition from Experiments with Mice, another quirky record produced by George Martin at Parlophone. Pre-RADA, which is the drama school that Brian Epstein attended, Brian took private acting lessons in a flat in Gambier Terrace, where John Lennon later flat shared with Stuart Sutcliffe. There's so many of these, and some of them are quite tenuous, so I'm just going to pick the best ones. Prior to their official first meeting at Wilton Village Fete, John and Paul may have possibly met outside a newsagent's called ABBA. I believe one of Paul's videos, Is It For You, from Egypt Station, has something about that. The strange similarity being, I suppose, that in one documentary I saw, it was actually the Clive James Fame in the 20th Century that I included a clip of in one of the Elvis episodes. ABBA did in the 70s what the Beatles did in the 60s, just create these tunes you couldn't help humming that were also very cleverly written as well. The Cavern opened in January 1957 as a jazz club in Liverpool's business district, before later becoming the Beatles' defining live venue in Liverpool. Its owner was a young man called Alan Sitner, whose doctor father lived on the same road as John and Mimi and went to the same synagogue as the Epstein family. This one's amazing. At the time that the young John Lennon wrote his first proper song, Hello Little Girl, there was another song with the title Hello Little Girl by Lloyd Price, released in America in 1957. Now you might think that's not that strange, because maybe John saw that title and thought, well, I'll write my own song. But the Lloyd Price Hello Little Girl included the line, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Paul and George took a hitchhiking trip together as teenagers heading for the southwest of England with bare essentials, including guitars. It was cold and uncomfortable, but still great fun as they travelled through Gloucestershire and Somerset. In Paynton, Devon, they met a drunk called Oxo Whitney, whose name ended up in one of John's stories. Their, quote, magical mystery tour covered roughly the same part of the country as the Beatles would 8 years later with a film of the same name. When the Quarrymen played at the wedding reception of George's older brother in the late 50s, the address was on Childwall Abbey Road. The Quarrymen made the primitive recording of That'll Be the Day in Spite of the Danger in Percy Phillips's studio, in inverted commas, in 1958. Phillips put the resulting record in a Parlophone sleeve for protection. Parlophone is a small label that the Beatles later recorded for and made famous. Not only this, but 5 years earlier a young Elvis Presley had made a similarly primitive recording with an engineer called Sam Phillips. In the summer of 1958, Brian Epstein was involved in another rough trade case. A few days before, Julia Lennon's lover, Bobby Dykins, crashed his car near Mendips while drunk. Both cases were tried at the same court, and Dykins' solicitor was Rex Makin, friend and neighbour of Brian Epstein's family, and a consultant in Brian's case as well. Of course, Julia herself would be hit by a car and killed in Woolton very close by and only 2 weeks after her lover's crash. John's probably false recollection that the policeman who knocked over Julia was drunk may have come from the Dykins incident. The album Songs for Swingin' Sellers, produced by George Martin, included an Indian track, possibly a parody of well-known Indian classical musician Ravi Shankar, that required sitar and tabla players to be brought to Abbey Road's No. 2 studio, as would be required later for George Harrison's Indian-flavoured Beatles tracks. In addition, Martin turned Sellers' comic genius into, quote, sound pictures, which is his description of later Beatles records. In a similar Eastern foreshadowing of later events, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi visited Britain in the early 1960s and was seen on television by Paul, expounding the virtues of transcendental meditation. While John was an art student, several all-night parties ensued, including one in the same house in Huskisson Street that John's mother had been living in at the time she'd married his father. How about this one? Tragically, the two American stars, Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran, were involved in a car crash between Bristol and London that killed Cochran. The other car was being driven by a man called George Martin. Don't tell me this wasn't preordained. I know George Martin is a fairly common name, but still. This one I think you'll probably know already. There was a well-known journalist working for the Liverpool Echo at the time of the Beatles called George Harrison. On the first journey to Hamburg, the Beatles loudly declared themselves to be heading for the toppermost of the poppermost, a line borrowed from Top Rank Records, whose head Dick Rowe would later reject them for Decca. On the same trip, they unknowingly passed within 700 yards of Abbey Road Studios, and Alan Williams' young brother-in-law later took a now iconic photo of the group at a cemetery, which was magically inscripted with the words, "Their name liveth evermore," giving the photo a whole new significance. One of the white headstones was for a private Peter Best, aged 19. The Indra, the first club the Beatles played in Hamburg, took its name from the German word for India. In yet another Indian coincidence, in late 1960, at the time of the first trip, a visitor to Hamburg, though certainly not San Pauli, was none other than the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, just under 7 years before becoming for a brief time the Beatles' guru. In July 1961, the Liverpool Echo reported the court prosecution of a Birkenhead man called Lennon, accused of stealing 3 electric guitars. The prosecuting counsel was called McCartney. There are just so many others, but how about this? Incredibly, of all the several million London addresses Paul could have been staying in when he went to visit Ivan Vaughan in 1962, Ivan happened to live in the same building in Great Portland Street where Margaret Asher, mother of Jane, gave George Martin oboe lessons 15 years earlier, prior to the Ashers moving to Wimpole Street. I mentioned the oboe lessons earlier. The Ashers were living in Wimpole Street by 1962, and the following year Paul went to live with the family. Just a few that are not to do with tuning. This remarkable thing about the Eastman's name originally being Epstein, which Alan Klein had found out while they were having the acrimonious business meetings in 1969. And apparently John Lennon just wouldn't leave that alone after that, just kept bringing up Epstein all the way through that meeting. The Beatles only had one recording session in the 70s, cementing the idea that they were a 60s band. That was 3rd of January 1970, where they did I Me Mine. I think Ringo may have come in to do overdubs and another song in 1970, but basically, at least there were 3 of them on the 3rd of January, so how perfect is that? Another thing I noticed when I was reading Tune In was how the four Beatles were all around Liverpool. Obviously, they all grew up there. So they were in fairly close proximity before they even knew each other. And in a way, they were sort of circling around each other. If you imagine, those camera shots from the sky where you can speed up the action of a day and you can see everybody moving around like ants, you can imagine that they were all meeting, and they met in twos and threes, and then finally all four of them were in the same room, so to speak. I guess that would have been around 60, 61. And Ringo famously sat in for Pete Best a few times. And then they were together until August 69. As far as we know, the final time they were together was the Tittenhurst Park photo shoot, just after they completed the recording of Abbey Road. And then they were sort of circling around each other in the 70s, mostly in America. And there were lots of meetings of twos and threes, but magically you never had the four in the same room. And then obviously John died in 1980, so it wasn't going to happen. But then the Three Tools reunited in the 90s. And the final time they were together was, I think they had a dinner in 2001, just before George Harrison died. And then finally the fact that Yoko Ono and Linda Eastman were both, I'm going to say, bourgeois Americans. Yoko's obviously Japanese, but spent a lot of time in America. They both had lived in Scarsdale. Both went to Sarah Lawrence. Both had a daughter in 1963. And John, of course, had a son in 1963. And both of them had either fancied or connected with the opposite chief Beatle. So Linda apparently was first attracted to John. Yoko met Paul before John. If you can think of any other coincidences, then please email them to me, glassonionpod@yahoo.com, or you can leave a comment on the link for this episode. So that was a long time as usual. Another one of my short intros. So very quickly, Ken Womack, the voice in my head is saying, don't spoil. So I'm not going to. Ken obviously did a lot of interviews for this book, lots of other podcasts, and we recorded this back in October. Although Ken's book was really about John Lennon's journey of recovering his muse, and it was basically a book about John's music primarily, I still wanted to ask Ken about John Lennon's state of mind, this continuing quest I've been on. I was on in 2020. He's probably going to continue into this year as well, to be honest. Ken was delightfully open-minded about this. You'll hear all this anyway. I don't need to be telling you this at all. Just before we go to the discussion, I guess you know about my Film Gold podcast, but the one I'm trying to push at the moment is my third podcast called Life and Life Only. And I've got a few episodes out there now, so if you'd like to subscribe, it's in all the usual places, and the Twitter is @LifeOnly75. Finally, there's a PayPal link on the homepage. If you'd like to make a donation to the show, you can do it there, or again, the PayPal is linked to glassonionpod@yahoo.com, and that's the place for feedback as well. So let's go to my discussion with Ken Womack, and I'll be back on the other side with a few words. Enjoy. Hi everybody, this is Glass Onion on John Lennon, episode something. We're recording this episode actually on October the 10th, the day after a certain birthday connected to this podcast. So I've got Ken Womack with me for the second time. We did try back in August, and for one reason or another. Partly, actually, I hadn't got his book by then. And as we were saying off air, it's a bit of a weird thing to talk to an author without reading his book. But anyway, delighted to have you back, Ken. So how you doing?
I'm doing great. And it's I relish the opportunity to speak with you again because it's a way of marking time in our COVID confinement.
Yeah, exactly. What better things could you be doing than talking to me? Well, you're writing again, aren't you?
Quite literally, yeah.
So I read your book over the last couple of weeks, and then today I was skimming through and I've writing some notes, but when I got to about 12 pages, I stopped. So Ken is the author of the new book, John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life. And Ken, according to Wikipedia, which never lets us down, according to, in fact, the jacket of your book, you've written 35 books. So just before we get into the book that we're discussing today, how did you become a writer, and what was the first Beatles thing you wrote, if you can remember?
The first Beatles thing I wrote was, I think, in 1978. It was my second year as a Beatles fan, and it was for my junior high school newspaper, the Kingwood Cougar, I believe. I know it well. Yeah, I mean, I'm certain that it's a worldwide publication. It's from Kingwood Middle School. Big shout out to you guys there. I wrote a piece on Paul is Dead because, of course, that seems fascinating when you're young to think that this whole hoax was performed. That may have been my first publication of anything. when I wrote it, I was also working at the newspaper as a budding journalist, and you had to typeset it. You would actually have to write each letter and fill in a blank. It took hours, even though it was a very short text. So I think that cured me of writing for a long time because I didn't want to fill out little blanks anymore for each letter and punctuation, right? That was my first publication, but I was raised on books by my parents and read a lot. In fact, they curated my reading experience. If I ever had a moment where I was starting to not read, they would come on in and hand me another book, don't start watching more Scooby-Doo or whatever.
Yeah.
Although I managed to find that time too. So that was my goal. It was all the way through college. And during graduate school at Texas A&M, I began publishing as a scholar, and that set me on the path that I am currently on. So while I have tried to position some of my books for the popular press and worked with agents, for the most part, I'm still just pursuing works of scholarship, heavily footnoted and endnoted and sourced work because, that's what you do when you're trained to be a scholar.
Right. While you were talking there, I was almost thinking of Bobby Fischer and chess because I'm very interested in him. And when he was a kid, his parents used to scold him when he was doing anything other than playing chess. It's like, well, you can have your breakfast, Bobby, but get back to the chessboard, son.
Yeah, no cartoons, Bobby.
Yeah. None of that childish stuff. All right. So, yeah, let's get to your book straight away. So, as I said, we're here on the October the 10th. The thing I perhaps wanted to get out the way first, listeners to the show will know that I've established a sort of Coleman-Goldman continuum where the reality of John Lennon is somewhere on this scale between everything was fine, he'd conquered all his demons, and he was a wasted drug addict sitting in his room. Just briefly, where do you stand on that? Or do you get bored of talking about that? Or is it interesting still?
No, I think it's a very interesting question. And actually, it's a very interesting scholarly question. And Goldman saw himself as a journalist scholar, right? He, I believe, and I have not personally gone to look at them, but I've spoken to many people who have and swear that his archive in the city, I believe it's at Columbia, that his archive is very profuse, well footnoted, and in fact, you can see the detail of his research. So let's just pretend for a moment that Goldman was right on the money in terms of what he had encountered. My issue with it, with his book, and it was almost immediately when I read it, even though I was quite young, and I remember thinking, what about the music?
Right.
This book is not showing the necessary deference to the music. Why would you have this book if you weren't interested in the music? Because the music is the raison d'etre, right? It's the reason why we're here.
Yeah.
And it was actually John Lennon's contention that he stated several times that, quit clamoring for Beatles reunions. You have the thing that matters. And I don't know that people even get that today necessarily, because the thing that matters is the music, which is why I wrote my book in the way I did. So I thought that was missing from Goldman's book. And like you and like so many other people, I've been thinking about this, for, my God, 30, 40 years, right?
Yeah.
Hard to imagine. But during that period, I've really come to the conclusion that in a sense, it doesn't matter. I include anecdotal information about drugs or affairs or what have you, only so far as it's germane to the story.
Right.
So the story to me is, how is he going to come back beginning in late 79? It's clear that that's on his mind and on Yoko's mind. How is he going to execute this comeback so that he can feel confident enough in his music to compete with all the big heavyweights out there? And frankly, all of the comers, disco's already there, new wave, punk, everybody who's on their way. It's a tall order, and it takes a lot of guts for him to do what he did. And at a certain point, I don't know about you, but I don't care if he was all the things in Goldman's book or if he's whitewashed lily clean like some of the other books. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And you and I have lived long enough now to know that a life is a muddled thing. One of the many things that John Lennon was denied was the ability to look back at his own life and think, wow, I was really going through something there, but look what I did. So he doesn't really get to have any of the kinds of epiphanies we get to have about his life or our own, for a guy who barely gets to become 40. So I kind of fall, I guess, in the middle of the continuum, but just realizing that, we all have our drugs of choice. Mine during the COVID confinement is if I could sit down with a tub of ice cream, I would go nuts and just, right? And I think once or twice I have, but then I've counteracted it with exercise. And I use that silly little, very non-important anecdote just to demonstrate that, we all have our relapses and moments of
heroin.
But somehow, and I like to think my book helps us to see this, somehow John Lennon, to quote Shakespeare, stuck his courage to the sticking post and got out there against all odds to give us this music, and as it turns out, in the nick of time.
Yeah, I mean, another reason I'm pleased we're doing this again is that I think last time you were trying to point me back to the music because I was perhaps getting a bit waylaid on that issue. Just to tell the listeners, your book has a narrative arc, which is a good thing for a book, which is the loss and recovery of the muse, basically, isn't it? So I totally agree with you. I've been questioning myself all year because we've done a number of shows, and I was able to talk to Caitlin Hare, who's Marnie Hare's daughter. Mm-hmm. And it's strange because we recorded that back in May, and for whatever reason, it hasn't come out for months, and I've almost forgotten what we said. So I'm quite looking forward to editing it and going back because I can't actually remember, but I do remember actually one thing that at the end of the talk, we were kind of saying, well, does it actually matter? And let me just explain perhaps why I'm interested in that. We had the birthday yesterday. Over the last week, I'm not sure what programs have been on in America, but there's been a new radio show with Sean Lennon. I'm sure you've heard that. And there was a strange documentary called John Lennon's Last Weekend by Sky Arts, which is a really good channel here in England. And I mean, I don't quite know what I was expecting, but I was just a little bit disappointed. But then when I thought about it afterwards, I thought, well, they're not going to put anything out that's not complimentary. But my issue with mainstream narratives of life is just what you've said. Life and people's lives are so complicated that the sort of version they trot out is always a bit too easy for me. That's all. So that's kind of my issue.
A couple of thoughts on that. That's a rich topic, right? So I remember hearing one of my graduate professors very early on say that, and it really kind of floored me at the time, but I think it's really true. And spending time with the Beatles, as we all have, lo these many decades, has really underscored this for me. He said that the best biographies are written 50 years after people are dead. Right. And of course, it's counterintuitive because you think to yourself, well, you wouldn't have all those first-person witness narratives. And you know what? He's still right, because his point was that the best testimony about an event happens at the time. It doesn't happen 40 years later. So we all love Sir Paul. I love him as much as anyone, and probably more than most. It's just our debt to him, along with John Lennon, for this amazing music is incredible. But, when he has reminiscences now, such as the one in the Ron Howard film about when they decided not to tour again, right, on August 29th. Well, that's just not true. We know from their earlier testimony, which was more contemporaneous with those events, that indeed they had already decided they were done with touring. And they'd stopped touring England, and they told Brian the bad news back in December 1965. But that's what happens when you go to witnesses 50 years after events have occurred. And I think we're about to see the same thing with the Peter Jackson revisioning of the Let It Be period, trying to say that it was hunky-dory and it was the Beatles, the lads, right? When in fact, their testimony at the time is that it was really horrible and they were having a terrible time. And one of them quits, right? But what makes that story wonderful, and it's the heart of the Beatles, is that at the end of the month, they pull this massive victory out of nowhere, like a great football team. They win in the end. They record a spate of absolute classic songs. They do the rooftop concert. They record Don't Let Me Down, Two of Us and I've Got a Feeling. And they do it in like 5 days. That's the Beatles. So tell the story and tell it real. It was horrible and it was rough. And they had to move to their own studio, which was also rough because they had a nutball friend who had mismanaged the installation of the equipment and probably never knew how to install the equipment in Magic Alex, right? That's the story. And that is a far better story than, hey, we're nostalgic and look how happy we are. And so I think that's why ultimately that graduate professor was right. And it was Professor Harrison T. Meserole, who has sadly been long since deceased. And that to me is the lesson from all of this, is trying to in a scholarly, careful fashion, get to what's true and what's not true, and to use the best sources to do that.
Yeah. I'm just saying that because, the other issue, I'm sure you've seen all these John Lennon quotes on the internet as well. Have you seen? Maybe some of them are verified, some of them aren't. I don't know. But, yeah.
Well, they're often not verified. In fact, I don't know if you noticed this. I had a little Easter egg up front in my book, which I'm now explaining for the first time on this, the most august Beatles podcast.
Go on.
Right?
I bet you've told that to everyone, haven't you?
I have not told this to anyone ever, and I'm going to tell you about it right now.
Go on then.
So, do you have your copy there?
Yes.
So go to the epigraphs, the lovely quotes up front.
Oh, yeah. Everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not.
Who says that?
Well, currently John Lennon.
And who's the other one?
A dream you dream alone is only a dream. A dream you dream together is reality. Yoko Ono.
That's right. That second quote is often attributed to John. And I've done a lengthy study because, as you said, there are many, many, many quotations out there, including the horrible one about Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles that have been disproven.
Yeah, because there's some ones that something like when I was a boy, a teacher asked me what I wanted to be, and I said happy or something. Yeah, it's these ones that sound a bit kind of on the nose, as you'd say in America.
That's right. Anyway, you could embroider them and hang them on your wall. Yeah,
like kind of easy spiritual. I'm all for spirituality. I'm a great believer in it, but they're just a bit too obvious for me. Anyway, with the book, the fact that you did have a narrative, does that compromise the writing at all, or was there anything in the book that you perhaps wanted to write about that just didn't fit the sort of narrative of recovering his muse?
The narrative is, I think, what saved me, because I set out at the beginning to only talk about things John could see. So, in other words, if it happened somewhere else at the same time and it wasn't germane to his story and he wouldn't have known about it and how it impacted him, it didn't go in. So that was a nice saving grace that kept me headed in a straightforward fashion. I like having a narrative that locks you in. And of course, this is the great thing about nonfiction. And it keeps you from straying into just long piles of anecdotal mess. And I could really do that. I've seen it happen where I get so lost in the minutia that I just leave the text for a while, and that's not good. It's not good writing. So I like having the narrative to hem me in. It just keeps you remaining true to form and pushing the story forward. And then if you're doing that, you're going to find the great moments of suspense. And the narrative arc then can take over. And of course, in this story, there are lots of wonderful moments of suspense to take advantage of.
Yeah, so the narrative gives you a center. I mean, I've never written a book, so I can't imagine how difficult it must be to collate it all together. So I guess it's something to hang it on, is what you're saying, right?
Well, my fear is that I've left out key events. And in fact, because there's been so much Lennon coverage, there have been a few tell-all books and various discoveries have been shared in the press. I find myself, after hearing some of them, whipping over to my copy of the PDF, which is searchable, of course, as everyone knows, and making sure I covered key events. Like, oh my God, did I cover that thing that happened when that photographer visited? And I'm usually relieved to find it.
Well, if I can make a criticism, you didn't describe his masturbatory habits anything like as much as I was hoping, but that was a joke. I mean, apart from talking about a brief relapse into heroin, kind of left out the weed. Is that, and I'm perfectly happy with that. Is that because you don't really feel that affected the story? It was just kind of a thing you did to relax, or?
Not only do I not feel like it affected the story, I mean, we're sitting here in a moment in time where it is no longer illicit or illegal. So it seems like a non-story to me.
Right, I see.
And that the narrative sizzle or even the romanticism of pot smoking seems to be like such a dead end at this point. It would be one thing if Sergeant Pilcher were still busting people, right?
Yeah, I was hanging around outside the Dakota.
Yeah, but it just felt like such a non-issue. I mean,
I see.
I've been to a few cities where it isn't legal yet, and because it's now so accepted, no one cares when people are walking around, Although I have to say, before the confinement, my wife and I went to a play on Broadway, and I suddenly felt like we were at a concert because I could smell somebody toking up before the show. It was almost anachronistic and out of place. Not so much because it was clearly the skunky smell of pot, but because it's illegal to smoke in buildings and certainly in theaters.
Yeah.
So it just made no sense.
So yeah, I'm not going to go chapter by chapter, by the way, but I was really happy that you had a lot of stuff about the Dakota, because I didn't really know. All I really knew about the Dakota was that it was used for Rosemary's Baby, and it kind of looked a bit like Strawberry Fields.
Well, thank you for that, because I wanted New York City / the Dakota to be a character in the book.
Right.
It is essential to understand where he was in 1980 and what he was doing and how the vicissitudes of life played out during that period by going into a lot of detail about what his world looked like, because you can march over there right now and it's not the same, other than the building's still there. It's just a different world because of gentrification, because of ordinances associated with building upkeep, crime, and all sorts of aspects like that. It's just not the same place anymore.
Yeah. So just going through a couple of things. So what's the name of that area? Is it called the Upper West Side? Is there a name for that sort of district he was living in, or where the Dakota is?
Sure. I mean, he was in the Upper West Side, but in his day, just to give you a sense, when you're looking at a map and you're thinking about what John Lennon's neighborhood looked like, the Upper West Side is actually quite a large place. You know, it's 4 blocks from the park to the river, the Hudson, and, you know, these are big city blocks. And the Upper West Side could technically start, I guess, with Columbus Circle and obviously go all the way up to Harlem. But John's neighborhood, particularly the way people lived in that time, would have seemed much smaller. So it would have gone up to maybe the History Museum to the north, and even that's pushing it, and probably only a couple of blocks over to Amsterdam Avenue. So, you know, people lived inside their neighborhoods for the most part back in those days. They didn't just run all over the city every day. And it's not to say that they wouldn't hit down to Broadway to see a play or go to the Village or go to Midtown to Manny's Music to look at the guitars or what have you. People did those things. Or in the case of John and Yoko, to head over across the island to Mr. Chow's, right? You know, folks did that all the time and jumped into cabs, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, in your day-to-day living, your bodega, your grocery store, your drugstore, your optometrist, were probably within 2 or 3 blocks of you.
Yeah.
And in fact, people would select their doctors and their primary care physicians based upon who was nearby. Yeah. And you can see that when you start walking around John Lennon's New York City, you find pretty quickly that his optometrist was nearby, his pharmacist, et cetera.
Well, you know, they say a lot of musicians are kind of homebodies, and I mean, I'm very similar. I've lived in quite a few cities, but I love to have everything around me. You know, set up a den in the house, and you know, and I mean, London is a bit like that as well. It's really a series of villages. I mean, if anyone goes to London, if you go to where Zone 1 of the metro would be, which is the very centre, I mean, that's not really London. That's a microcosm of the whole world, probably. A bit like New York. But,
yes,
you know, London is essentially a bunch of villages, which are all kind of stuck together and called a city. But, yeah, that's the thing I was getting onto, was that they're obviously an exclusive place. There's a lot of rich people living at Dakota, but you give the impression it was actually quite dangerous. Would that be dangerous during the daytime or just at night?
It would have been at night. The Dakota itself wasn't dangerous. Okay. And it was in an interesting transition period, right? While it had always been this august address on the Upper West Side, it did cater to a certain bohemian culture. Mm-hmm. Now, by 1980, the cost of the units were pricing out bohemians. You know, that wasn't going to be the norm anymore. In fact, that summer, I think, was when they had rejected Billy Joel. You know, now Billy Joel could afford it. They just didn't want his kind of bohemianism, probably. And I think some of the other tenants had become tired of John Lennon and all the crowd that he would bring, and Billy Joel would only be worse, right? Because, of course, he was building his glass houses at the time. Right. So in any event, obviously where we're going here is that it was just a different place. It was a different kind of world. And in terms of crime, those were back in the days when, you know, you'd walk across the park during the day, but you didn't go to the park during the night.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was, you know, in fact, the 80s, even while we're starting to see some of the gentrification and socio-cultural change in the city at night, there would be several major examples of, you know, murder and mayhem that would occur in places where you might very easily walk during the day.
Yeah, I mean, again, another parallel with London, because I don't know if you spent much time in London, but I used to live in a place called Ladbroke Grove.
I know it well.
Oh, yeah, I had some of the best times of my life, actually. You can imagine if we had a 4-share house, lots of people over all the time, etc. But it was funny. It's near Notting Hill. Notting Hill is obviously very gentrified now.
Well, the whole place is built up, all of those neighborhoods there with new flats that, by the way, are so expensive. My wife and I ponder the signs sometimes, dreaming of living in London, and we'll look at in the windows of the real estate agents, and it's hilarious because they'll say, you'll see a number like £1,500, and you're thinking, wow, I could rent here right now. But then you notice it's per week.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah. New York, where all dreams are made of, as long as you can afford it. No, the point I was going to say, we lived in Ladbroke Grove, and it wasn't quite as gentrified as Notting Hill, but it was nearby. But we used to get the local paper put through our letterbox, and we'd read about stuff, and there was always crimes happening 2 streets away, because we were pretty much on the main road, so we were more or less okay. But, we were very, very close to some nasty stuff going on,
Yeah, what would happen, right, Antony, if the criminal decided, let's walk over 2 blocks?
Exactly. But it's bizarre to just read about it happening regularly right on your doorstep. It's very strange. Yeah, so they moved to Dakota in 73 and then gradually started buying up quite a few apartments there. Do we know why they chose the Dakota? And were they both involved in that?
They lived down in the Village in their Bank Street apartment. And, again, in those days, it was tight down there. You did have significantly more crime. This is the period when they're quite literally not finished building the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. So all of the incredible gentrification of Lower Manhattan just wasn't happening yet. It was on the verge. And even the mall that would help change Lower Manhattan wasn't completely drawing folks for quite some time, So all of those things were still in progress. They also needed more space. They planned to make New York City their home. And I like to think about this period in terms of today's rock stars, right? So folks like Bruce Springsteen and Paul McCartney have these huge warehouses where they store all of the stuff that they've collected over the years. And while sadly John Lennon wouldn't live to be their ages, he had tons of material that had been accumulated during his Beatle years and beyond, and they needed places to store it. And so quite frankly, the Dakota, and that's the reason they kept buying up those units, had plenty of space for them to locate all of this memorabilia and treasure, all of John's guitars. And this was before the days when rock stars were renting out warehouses or buying warehouses. So that hadn't even been imagined yet at this point. So they needed it as much for the space as anything else.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, what's the next thing? Oh dear, I'm going to take the risk of falling back into the Coleman-Goldman continuum now.
Oh, you won't hurt me.
Okay. No, I just noticed that you quoted Fred Seaman quite a bit, and obviously you had his book as one of the sources. I mean, I read that book a long time ago, and I read it again this year, and I nearly had Fred on the show, but I don't know if you know, but he actually was sued recently by Yoko. I think it was about a week ago. Now I understand why he was reticent. He said, I would like to, but it's complicated. But anyway, I don't know when the last time you read his book was, but how much did that ring true for you?
Well, quite a lot. And I do use Fred's book as a guide because there's nothing else in many ways. When you look back at that period, Yoko is handling the finances. She's often back in the Dakota when he and Fred are out on Long Island, or she is at their new estate down in Palm Beach when Fred and John are tooling around in the car. So, if you want to try to do a granular look at this period, you got to get in that car too.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Or you're not going to understand it. In fact, until late in the year when they send Fred for a couple of weeks to Bermuda to get the Fairylands Villa Undercliff estate in order because John and Yoko are thinking about having a little sojourn out there, he is there every day. And Fred is the source we have, like it or not, who can allow us to understand what John was having him go out and buy, right? Usually records and books. And, to understand this story, you got to have just about the only witness who was there other than a 4-year-old. Sean was often there too. And that's the place you have to go to. So, I know that for whatever reasons, Fred is a kind of conflicted witness from some folks' perspectives, but he's all we've got. And we wouldn't know very important turns in the story if Fred hadn't been there.
Yeah. I'm pleased you said that because, like I said, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there, obviously. Everything on my podcast is my best guess, and I always tell my listeners that. But when I read his book, I mean, the portrayal of John Lennon is not necessarily negative. I think it was just negative. Oh, if you take Goldman out of the equation and say that the Ray Coleman narrative was what I guess still the majority would say is closest to the truth, I think it was just that the narrative was straying away from that. And also, Seaman did have an association with Goldman, which I think is going to put a lot of people off. But the picture that he paints of John Lennon is of this incredible character who's a little bit on edge, which I think John Lennon would admit he was. But he was just this sort of wealth of knowledge, and would just talk and talk and talk. And one of the most touching bits of Fred's book, because I read it, like I said, about 6 months ago, was when he said, when he had a couple of days away from John Lennon, he started to miss him because the John Lennon magic, whether you think he's wasting away in the Dakota doing nothing or baking bread or whatever, I think there must have been an incredible magic. I mean, if I was Fred Seaman and I got that job, I know it really affected him quite negatively because he was on call 24 hours a day. And I'm sure there's a great deal of stress involved. But also, I mean, what an opportunity to have that kind of access to John Lennon. It must have been just fabulous, and stressful.
A couple of observations about Fred, who I have met on multiple occasions. I imagine that not only was that the great defining period of his life, Fred has been contending like I think many, if not all of the people who were in that close, small world of the Dakota and John Lennon and their family, they've never stopped dealing with those ramifications of what happens in December, right?
Sure.
It ripped everybody's world apart in deep pain for people who like those folks, especially obviously Yoko and Sean and Julian, who loved him very much, but also people like Fred who were there in and out, or, Richie DePalma, all those people who were there with him every day, or Mike True, it's just, they're never going to get over that. I thought a lot about Fred obviously shared a lot of material with Goldman during the 80s. And I believe, and others may disagree, but knowing Fred, I believe that he probably shared that material in good faith with Goldman, as did May Pang, only to see a book come out that wasn't giving a rounded picture of him. And, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you think of John Lennon as a character in these nonfiction books, which he is, right, then you have to present as best you can a well-rounded character. So I tried to show the moments when John would say to himself, hey, he was mad about that heroin relapse, remember? Or he was angry. He was mad about sexual impulses. When will this stop? These are things that are on the record that John Lennon said. And it helps us to understand that he was a round character. And as we said earlier, a life is a muddled, conflicted, confusing thing that only begins to make sense when you look 3 weeks later at something. And that makes it more powerful and interesting. And I don't believe Fred's ever gotten over these sorts of things. But what he has given us is a useful kind of, and this is a loaded word, so please forgive me, but it's a kind of diary of dates. Forget about John's diary and all of those issues for the moment. It's a useful chronicling of dates so that we know when things happened. We know when John heard Coming Up. John will later tell us that he heard Coming Up and it inspired him. But Fred is able to show us that he heard the Paul McCartney song on a certain day, weekend in April, and where they were. And that is, in a scholarly sense, really vital testimony. So when I was working on this book, particularly last year, when it became apparent to some folks in the internet world that I was working on it, they'd say, well, you better not use Seaman, because he stole some journals and other material and he can't be a good source. Well, he did those things, but he's still a good source because he's eyewitness testimony to events as they took place. And we have to then go look at those events, collate them with what else we can find in the record, certainly starting with what John may have said or others in that intimate circle would attest to, and go from there. And Fred is there serving John. And as I'm sure you've gathered, and this is still true, Fred clearly loved and admired him and is still mourning that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain characters in rock and roll. I think John Lennon was an amazing person to be around and would have been even if he hadn't been famous. I think becoming famous gives you a certain, I don't know, a poise or something, because most people never have to deal with audiences and crowds and things. And I think being in the public eye, especially being a Beatle for 10 or 20 years, it probably gives you a certain ability to deal with people.
Absolutely. And he was a guy who clearly, if you read and listen to the many, many wonderful interviews he conducted, even in those last months of his life, he loved to chew on an idea. And he was willing to come back to the idea 10 minutes later and say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not right about that. That's not what I really think. He was very authentic, and we like friends like that in our world who are willing to do those things. Yeah. And then there's just the simple aspect that because of, I'm sure, certain challenges in his upbringing in his life, he just liked people, and he wanted to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I try to include many of these stories in my book, and I've heard others tell of them, that even though he was nervous about strangers who would be staring at him across a restaurant or what have you, he really genuinely liked people and liked to share with them and actually wanted to hear their story, because he was probably, first of all, sick of his, but he genuinely wanted to hear their story. And I've heard that from many, many people who said, John wanted to get around to their issues and their story. He was done with his.
But how do you get to the lyric then? You say you want to save humanity, but it's people you just can't stand. Do you think that's more of a sort of general comment, or?
I think it's a general comment, sure.
Yeah, I just.
How many people have said the world is wonderful except for all these people everywhere?
Yeah. I was just thinking about what you just said when you said, he'd be changing his mind, because it's very interesting. If you have a podcast, you always wonder who's listening, and it's very interesting. You know what the Radio Times is? It's the TV TV listings, and obviously they had a lot this week about this week as we're recording this with John Lennon's 80th birthday, and very interesting. They said that John Lennon, if he was alive today, would probably spend a lot of time on Twitter writing angry tweets and then apologizing for them. And that's exactly what I've been saying on the show pretty much all the last year, because I always ask the guests, What do you think John Lennon would have been doing? So I think the Radio Times are listening to Glass Onion. I should have copyrighted the idea.
Well, everybody needs the Glass Onion. But I think he would have been very much like Bowie, who just for a while was in thrall over the internet, right? Because here's this thing that, he's been trying and was successfully communicating to his audience so often and so long. And here's this internet where you can do it immediately.
Yeah, you don't have to go anywhere either.
Yeah.
I can imagine him firing off something along the lines of, I am he as you are me, and we are all together, which takes 2 seconds to think of if you're John Lennon. It takes, 30 seconds to write. And obviously, you can imagine what his online presence would be if he was alive now. He'd be communicating his spiritual, existential missives to the whole world within seconds. I mean, how perfect is that?
Well, it would certainly be better than much of the other noise in the Twitter sphere, especially.
Yeah. Oh, God. Trying to imagine if he was around now and whether he'd appear on my show. I could be talking to him about 1980 as well.
It would certainly be a better source.
No, I didn't mean it like that.
I do.
Well, he's a good source in one sense because he's actually John Lennon, but then judging from interviews, he may not be the best source.
Sure, but what we lost, which is an understatement, but we lost so much on December 8th. Another thing we lost was his ability to get a little further away from those months and reflect on them with some distance, and he doesn't get that. So, he has to speak, and I know this annoys a lot of folks out in the world, he has to speak in shorthand. So what have you been doing? I've been baking bread, raising the kid, hanging out. That was shorthand for, hey, everybody, I had an infant and I was exhausted after years of fighting an immigration fight, of all sorts of lawsuits, the Morris Levy bit, the fact that I've been a Beatle and killing myself for 10 years and exhausting myself. At a certain level, he has to be forgiven for recharging his batteries. And he had the same problem when he was a kid trying to explain why he didn't live with his mother, right? He got tired, undoubtedly, of having to rehearse this situation and rehash it over and over again. And that was sort of the same place he was at in 1980. So let me explain for the upteenth time why I didn't have any new records from 1976 through 1979.
Yeah. Just playing that game,
He wanted to talk about the new music.
Again, from Fred's book and from other testimonies, even Jack Douglas sort of said that at the end of a day of recording Double Fantasy, John used to fire up a pipe and talk for a couple of hours about his life. And you can imagine everyone in the studio is hanging on his every word, because they're probably not getting the official version then, are they? You know, they're not getting the reporter-friendly version. They're probably getting the real stuff, you know. Okay, let's talk about the muse. Why do you think he lost the muse in the first place? Because for most people, there's a sort of drop-off between... I really like Walls and Bridges. I don't know what you think, but...
I do too, absolutely. And I love the song, the one about May Pang is one of my favorites.
Well, surprise.
Yeah, it's got a great groove to it.
Mm. So when do you think he lost the muse, and why?
Well, first of all, I probably don't phrase it as well as I could, because what he does is, I think he's exhausted and trying to come up with new songs and to be in that rat race where every year you have to have 14 new great tracks or what have you, has simply exhausted him. And during that period, you have all of these huge hit makers, new hit makers who've emerged. I mean, Elton John is this global star, right? Fleetwood Mac, the old blues band, when he quit, is now this pop band of incredible proportions, right? McCartney, at one point, John said, Paul puts out so many hits, it's hard to keep up. Having said all of this, the point is that it was a muse that he was having trouble grappling with, but he also knew that to come out and to be the public John Lennon again, it needed to be something that, you know, was unquestionably good. And that's the kind of issue that creates doubts. Now, we can go back and listen to those demos, which, by the way, if your audience hasn't done it, go to YouTube and just listen to some of them. They're marvelous. The early workings out of Real Love or Nobody Told Me especially, they're just lovely to hear. And you know, while John may not have totally gotten it at the time, he was really onto something. So I think it has as much to do with confidence and just the strange changing nature of competition in the 70s that was holding him back.
Was there actually a point in those 5 years, 75 to 80, where he didn't compose anything? Because I understood that it was almost, well, you tell me, was there a year where he did actually literally put the guitar down and didn't produce anything?
I don't think so. I can't find a period like that when you really take the time, and others have done this. Peter Dodgett, for example, did a wonderful book called The Art and Music of John Lennon some years ago. I know that Chip Madinger has done this too. I did my own analysis while studying folks like them to understand it, and then later Fred for 1980. And you can begin to see that he never takes time off from music making. He can't stop coming up with tunes. I don't know that there's a period, for any lasting period, where he doesn't do that, where he doesn't have his guitar handy. I just don't think he was confident in what he was doing. And that's why you see him, and this is such an interesting anecdote too, that's why he flitters from one genre to another, right? He tries making his mind movie tapes. He tries writing a musical. He tries writing it down longhand. He tries doing an audio diary, and all of this leads him back eventually to the thing he really is great at, which is being this rocker songwriter guy. When he gets back to that guy, suddenly he's on really sure footing again.
The audio diary is quite amusing in that after 10 minutes he goes, this is fucking boring.
Yeah, he just, right, he can't sustain it, but it makes sense. That's not his mode. And he himself had pointed out back in 1967 with Magical Mystery Tour, and after the death of Brian Epstein, you know, the Beatles need to quit trying to be these people who think they can just move from one genre to another. And because they're magnificent as songwriters and performers, that they can suddenly turn and, you know, make this Magical Mystery Tour film. It's not like that. Our skills are often not as portable as we might think.
Yeah. I would like to think that at some point perhaps he would have tried something a bit more long form. I mean, I'd love to have read a novel, for example.
No, I'm right with you. I would love to have read something long form. I was reading just last night about John back with Auntie Mimi. You know, she was very much, in terms of her parental role in his life, the kind of person who would require him, you know, she would say, here's another book, read this book, read the Reader's Digest, which they subscribe to, you know. And he had to have had a novel in him at some level.
Every book I read about John Lennon, one of the big, well, we always think of him as not particularly consistent in his life, but books seem to have been a huge part. I think before we actually started recording today, you and I were talking about that. I mean, me personally, books are almost my center, you know. I feel relaxed when I'm reading a book. And obviously you accumulate knowledge as well. And it's nice for people like him to have that parental figure when you're young to tell you to read the books. And
the beauty of books, and it doesn't happen every time or it wouldn't be so beautiful, is when we can find ourselves lost in them and they sort of take over our world for a few hours or a few days or what have you. And we don't want them to end. Those are the books I want to read. And of course, they're not all like that. And if they were, they wouldn't be as special.
Yeah. I mean, I've just spent 3 weeks with Moby Dick, which...
Were you okay with all those whaling chapters?
Well, that's the thing. I thought it was a very novel approach. Yeah. For anyone who hasn't read that book, it's a sort of an adventure story. But then in between the adventure story, you get chapters all about the science of whaling. And it's one of those books where you get to the end of it and you just feel like a real buzz. It's like, oh, what an awesome adventure that was. I've completely forgotten all those chapters about whaling, but, don't ask me any questions about whaling. But
I will not.
That's an example of a book. I mean, there's certain books I read where I think I could possibly write that, could have written that. But that one is like, oh, my God.
But you'd have to have lived in a few centuries ago at this point.
Yeah. There's so many references in that book. There's even a guide at the back of the novel. There's 300 references, many of which are biblical and Shakespearean and so forth. Anyway, yeah, so I feel like, maybe you might have written music for films, something like that. But I'd like to have seen something more substantial. Let's talk about, get a bit lost in the name. So they had a residence in Palm Beach. They obviously went to Bermuda, and Cold Spring Harbor is near New York, isn't it?
That's right. It's, I guess, an hour out of the city up on the North Shore. And the place down in Palm Beach was called El Solano, and Cannon Hill was the name of the place on Long Island.
That's the one. We mentioned the audio diary. The most poignant bit for me is the bit where he hears the bagpipes, first of all. And then there's a bit where he says, our mother's going to buy another property, still trying to recreate Scotland outside of New York.
That's right.
Which, I don't know, that kind of makes me tear up a little bit, because Scotland had a special place in John Lennon's heart, because, he did have a lot of difficulties in his childhood. And I think he used to go on holidays there, and it was almost perfect, So that's very poignant. We spend a lot of our time doing that, don't we? We're trying to recreate our childhood in some way or another. Trying to get that innocence back, That's what I've been trying to do anyway. Yeah, so I guess people all know, John here's coming up, the famous fuck a pig moment. We'll get on to Bermuda in a sec, but I think one of my favorite bits in your book, and one of my favorite bits of the story of those 5 years, is the boat trip. Correct me if I got any of this wrong. So it was Newport, Rhode Island to Bermuda, 635 miles, and it took about 6 days, I think, something like that, June 1980. The boat gets in a storm. I think the storm was going for 40 hours. Is that right? Something like that?
It was pretty common to hit some kind of weather as you went through the Gulf Stream.
Right.
On that particular voyage. And so Captain Hank knew that they were going to hit something, but it was a doozy. In fact, it tore up some of their sails, right?
Mm. And they're only in a schooner. I mean, a schooner is not a big boat by any means, is it?
No, but, they did have very contemporary technology. So it was going to take a hurricane gale to take them out, if at all.
Mm. So everyone except the captain gets sick, but the captain hasn't slept for more than 24 hours. So he goes to have a kip, as we'd say in England, a little siesta. And John's at the controls. And like I say, I don't buy all the stories in some books about John Lennon, but I buy this one completely. And I can imagine him rising to the occasion and thinking, this is better than drugs. This is, and I think it sort of played into a kind of seafaring myth in his head, because I don't think he actually spent that much time at sea, but obviously Alf, his father, was a seaman. He grew up in Liverpool. He was living in New York, got the docks nearby. I think it was some sort of myth, but now suddenly he's playing it out and he's controlling the boat, and I can just imagine him singing sea shanties. And I think you say, he starts shouting at the gods. I can imagine him shouting to the gods, what am I doing here on Earth? What's my purpose? Tell me something.
Unfortunately, John himself gave us that narrative on more than one occasion where he described the kind of mythical experience it felt like to him. So good on him for doing that for us. It also always hits me that here we have this guy who's experienced everything, and he's just discovering it during this, seafaring trip in June 1980.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm saying, I'm not even joking when I say, it's probably better than any drug for him, because he was, he took all that LSD for a reason, to try and find, why am I here? Is there anything I need to be doing?
Yeah.
that I'm not doing,
Yeah, there is definitely. And, I had the same kind of response when I was thinking about the last night when they were working on Walking on Thin Ice. And John, in an excited moment says, "This is the direction." I mean, if you're just now figuring it out, what chance do any of us have?
Yeah, I think he just had something in him aside from the music where he just probably did feel, I don't know, he was supposed to be doing something and he wasn't quite sure what it was, and it's just such a great image. I mean, I'm almost pleased there isn't a film of that, or because then we can just imagine it in our heads. John Lennon shouting at the gods in the middle of a storm. It's just fantastic. Yeah, so we get to Bermuda. This idea that, he wrote the whole album in Bermuda, what I feel he did, and tell me what you think, is that he found a space where, he did get inspiration. He managed to collate all the fragments into a whole. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's how he wrote. He would those fragments and he would bring them together. And this was true in his Beatle days and his last months. Occasionally a song would come full flower like Woman or perhaps Grow Old With Me,
right?
Which were written around the same time in July 1980. But for the most part, he would work up some fragments and bring them together. And that was the nature of his process.
Yeah, another great John Lennon contradiction is that there's that clip in from January 69 of George asking him for advice. And he said, as soon as you've got an idea, finish it. I love the way John Lennon doesn't take his own advice. But yeah. And again, from Fred Seaman's book, I found it very moving because Fred said, suddenly, this is the John Lennon that I thought I was going to be working for,
Yeah, and I asked him about that, what was your favorite time? And he said, immediately, watching John and Yoko make those records.
Yeah.
That was it. He just immediately thought, this is it. This is what I thought I would see. And not only did he see it, but it blew his mind.
And I think in Fred's book, he mentions that it was the borrowed time idea, the living on borrowed time, that kind of sparked it. And I don't know if that's true, but it's quite eerie if you think about it. I mean, you got John Lennon singing Living on Borrowed Time and Yoko's singing Walking on Thin Ice. We won't get into, whether either of them had a premonition because Fred did give some testimony that John Lennon said, I'm destined to die a violent death. But
sure, and I believe he shared a similar observation with Jack Douglas. It's like Abraham Lincoln, though, in a way, right? Everything they say suddenly takes on this kind of greater urgency and power because we know what happened. So it's interesting. And of course, John Lennon and Yoko obviously saw themselves as working in this kind of cosmic realm. And so it begins to take on a kind of otherworldly aspect to it. But, the one thing we do know, and he says this on the day he's murdered, he wants to live a long time because he has so many ideas and things to do.
Oh, God. I mean, it's awful, isn't it? He says, I always consider my work to be one piece and it won't be finished till I'm dead and buried. And I hope that's a long time. Anyway,
right.
We're not going to harp on that today. So they get back from Bermuda. They start recording Double Fancy. The thing I was very interested in was that they brought in arrangers. Now I'm wondering, so John Lennon's got these tapes of him playing it. So what would an arranger actually do? Would they be switching verses and choruses around, or is it just getting...
No, better even. Yeah, I don't think they would have dared to change the structure of his songs. This was brilliant, and we owe Jack Douglas for this brainchild. He thought of bringing in Tony DeVillio, who is a really expert arranger and is happily still with us. And Tony took the songs from those recordings, and obviously he was under strict confidence, and made arrangements for them so that the band, as Jack rehearsed the band, could get right to it and start working on those songs. And what a time saver that was, because it allowed John Lennon and the band to come into the studio on August 7th and just hit the ground running and capture the songs. But then, of course, that would leave them space to come up with new ideas and dream up new aspects to them. So you hear, for example, Hugh McCracken and Earl Slick dreaming up that wonderful ascending guitar cadence on Starting Over. That really adds to the song because they were already familiar with it. And bringing in DeVillio was fantastic and a really smart move by Jack that really amped up the recordings and got things going much faster. And of course, that was the hallmark that John Lennon loved, right? He didn't like to toy over some idea for 6 months. He wanted to get in and get the recording down.
Absolutely, yeah. So what would be on there? Would it be the chords? There wouldn't be the melody, would it? I guess it'd be the chords and the arrangement?
Oh, absolutely. So, and you had different levels of musical comprehension inside that band.
Right.
At least you needed chord symbols for the scratch musicians, while others could sit down and look at a piece of music and play it out. Like George Smalls, for example, without a doubt, could read notation, while a guy like Earl Slick would probably appreciate just having the chords so that he could work from there. In fact, DeVillio has a really excellent book where you can see some of his notation for the songs.
There was one funny bit in the book, though. Is it Beautiful Boy when I think John's starting a take and they're reading the charts and John says, to paraphrase, it's 3 chords, put down the fucking charts. I'm misquoting Mr. Lennon there, but you get the idea.
And what he wanted was just to get on with it, right? I mean, you can hear him say that at the beginning of the first take of Nobody Told Me. Earl was outside or something, or who knows, but John said, where's Slick? And Slick wasn't there. He said, well, then we'll just do it without him.
Well, he took a sickie, didn't he, Earl Slick, because he had a hard night out.
Yeah, sure. And so, as far as John was concerned, we're here to get business done,
Yeah, well, John must have been a bit torn because one part of him would probably bollock him, as we'd say in England, reprimand him. But then he's thinking, hang on a minute, I've had a few nights out. So he said, don't worry, mate, I understand. The other thing this sort of puzzled me a little bit. They seem to be going between the record plant and the hit factory. They start in, we're going to get this wrong, they start in the record plant and move to the hit factory or vice versa. Then they go to the other one to mix and then they go back again. Do you know why they kept switching there?
Switching on what again?
Between the record plant and the hit factory.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is actually one of the stories that I didn't have a complete grip on until I talked to some of the engineers at both studios. And a lot of folks have surmised that what was going on is that perhaps Yoko had issues with Roy Cicala at the record plant with whom they had worked, and they'd had some friction over the years. But apparently Roy was like that. I don't think that was the case at all in retrospect, because after talking to these, as I said, these engineers, it became clear that there was a kind of cold war between the two studios, a little bit of resentment. And it was because the record plant came along first. And the folks who developed the hit factory were kind of maverick. They got a lot of help from the record plant and their resources and Cicala. And then they went out on their own and they started franchising what may have seemed to the folks at the record plant like they were franchising all over the place. And so there was kind of some grittiness there. And so you were either in the record plant camp or the hit factory camp, and Jack was a record plant guy, and here they were recording at the hit factory. Now he's, of course, it's a work for hire. He's going to the hit factory because Yoko wants a place that seems a little more off the beaten path, and it does take fans a while to figure out where they are. But there's all of this bad blood, so on occasion you will see them trying to ameliorate that situation, and it was quite interesting. You wouldn't have known it looking back at it, but it's like any workplace, right, that has a competitor. There's some angst. And that was what was going on there. And, interestingly, they were really into each other's business the way competitors and friends can be, right? The way competitors and frenemies can be. I love the story about Tony DeVillio, all of this secrecy about where they're going to start on August 7th. And Tony forgets, and he goes to the record plant. So while Roger Farrington's taking those important photos over at the hit factory and the band's assembling for the first time, and Jack and John Smith and all those guys are getting ready, Tony goes to the record plant and he goes up to the reception. He's like, I'm here for the John and Yoko session. Where is it? And, the woman sort of leans forward and she says, it's over at the hit factory. Come on. First of all, it wasn't that big a secret. But then secondly, of course,
So it's kind of a tribal thing,
Absolutely.
Two rival studios, yeah. And then you wrote about a lot of overdubs, I must say. Now, this is a very well-worn John Lennon question, but when Double Fantasy Stripped Down came out in 2010, I did fall in love with that version. So was Double Fantasy overproduced? What would you say?
Boy, a lot of people have been saying that lately, and I don't agree. Okay. I think Jack was working with some pretty tough clients who were concerned about the marketplace, and he worked very hard to capture their vision. He was trying to make a record and position it to be a hit in a really competitive field, and he nails it. So I think we would see far more overproduced records shortly thereafter in the 1980s.
Yeah, it's only the dawn of the 80s after all.
Yeah. I mean, he's at the good side of that curve, right? And there will be records that I just can't listen to now
Yeah.
Even some that I truly liked at the time because they sound so glitzy and plastic and sugary, and you almost can't reach into them because there's this like plexiglass wall around them. And I don't feel that way about Jack's recordings for Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey. I feel like they're accessible. So.
And what do you think about the harp play thing? Because I'll be honest, I kind of made my own John Lennon 1980 compilation because it works quite nicely. Because if you take the Milk and Honey stuff, obviously some of it wasn't finished, but if you take the Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey John Lennon songs, you got a pretty neat John Lennon 1980 album, which I think is fairly strong. Do you think they needed to make an album together? Or, wouldn't it be nice to have a Yoko Ono 1980 album? Why did they need to be together, do you think?
Well, I think they wanted.
Okay.
They wanted to have an album together. And there's a lot of dispute about that, right? Did John really want to make a Yoko 2 album? All I can do is trust David Geffen, who tells that moving story about his different conversations with John and Yoko, and John pulling him aside and saying, we got to make this a hit for Yoko. And then Yoko going over to David and say, this is really important to John, don't blow this. So the only thing I can see when I look back at it now, looking through the lens of all of this scholarship that exists out there, is this is two spouses who, no matter what else they were to each other in 1980, and there's a lot of speculation about that, right? Who else they were to each other in 1980, they were each other's cheerleaders. And, that alone makes the heart play interesting and worthwhile to me. I enjoy the fact that we've elevated John's vocal, his backing vocal on Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him, which is John really getting into the groove and the vibe she was creating.
Yeah, there's very few duets, aren't there? I mean, I like those two lines from Bungalow Bill where they're singing together. I really like that. But yeah, there's hardly any of them together.
And I think, frankly, their best song as a couple is the last one they ever make. I think it's a bravura star turn. Walking on Thin Ice to me is a brilliant recording it's a Yoko song, but it's really a John and Yoko song with them bringing elements of themselves into play and just hitting a grand slam.
Yeah, and it's got that edge. I mean, I personally, this is only my opinion. I think Double Fantasy is lacking a certain edge that perhaps the Milk and Honey songs had a little bit. But anyway, that's my opinion. The other thing was that they recorded, how many hours was it they recorded of outtakes and chatting? Was it over 100, I think you said? 130, I think. I can't remember.
For sure. I mean, there are for sure. And when you throw in the demos, I mean, it's just a wall of music that exists out there.
And there's that amazing interview where it's not really amazing because you can't hear what he's talking about, but there's that little bit of an interview in the studio where you got like the Star Wars effects going on in the background. That's a shame because he gets into some interesting stuff.
He does, but you can hear them just really trying to get that right, because he's obviously doing it for Sean, right? A little fun video game moment.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've heard a fair few Double Fantasy outtakes, and like I say, I just like the four of them together or five of them, or whoever it was. I like those versions. That's just my opinion. But Walking on Thin Ice, can't argue with that. I mean, it's an absolute classic. And I mean, they were more or less working round the clock, weren't they, for the last, what turned out to be the last few days of his life. Sure,
it was about a week, and they went back and they took the song and they sort of broke it down to its foundations. I guess they kept the Tony Levin bass part. Yoko remade her vocal in spectacular fashion. She's in much better voice that week in December. Maybe it was because they'd recorded so much music during the earlier period, but her voice is really strong. And of course, she comes up with that wonderful poem and the sound effects. I mean, she's just cooking like never before. You have John just tearing up that solo with an assist from Jack Douglas. And of course, amazing effects. It has its own it's its own universe, really, that song. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I love it.
And even the way that Jack flies in Yoko's looped vocal of ice, ice, ice at the very end is ethereal.
I think there's a disco version, isn't there? Because I was listening to it last week. I think it's like a 9-minute version or something. Because it's got that space. It's got that very Plastic Ono band, really, isn't it? They almost invented that 10 years earlier, that kind of minimalist rock thing.
Oh, yeah.
But there's definitely some disco versions of that. I mean, that's a very 80s thing, isn't it? The 12-inch. If anyone can remember those 12-inch records.
Absolutely. I have a Good Night Tonight version.
Oh, have you? All right. Unfortunately, we're circling back to this where was John Lennon at in 1980 thing. But like I say, one of these documentaries I watched the other day it kind of all hung on this Andy Peebles interview. I've got to be honest, Ken, I listened back to the Andy Peebles interview. It sounds a bit like a John Lennon performance. You know, he's on form that day. But when you hear him say that he didn't play music for 5 years and you know that the complete opposite's true, it just makes me think, well, doesn't that call everything into question? I don't know.
Well, again, I think, to my mind, and you're right, it is an interesting performance that day. He's excited because, you know, as Yoko said, Peebles was a countryman as far as John was concerned. He was interested in really nailing it. He's so excited they continue at Mr. Chow's later, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
It doesn't stop. And he's clearly he's agog with excitement. You know, I don't know how else to say it. So it is a kind of performance, but that's him speaking in shorthand. You know, do you explain everything in excruciating detail? Or maybe he still feels bad about his lack of confidence or his inability to join the fray for whatever reasons. You know, we could speculate for hours, but I think that's him speaking in shorthand again. He may be doing it more elaborately, knowing it's going to be on the BBC. He has at that point 40 years and 2 months of experience thinking about how vaunted the BBC is, right? I mean, that's a lot of baggage in itself.
Yeah.
But that to me is him speaking in shorthand, just probably in a more elaborate way than some of the other interviews like Dave Sholin the next day or the David Sheff Playboy interviews.
Yeah, Jonathan Cott as well.
That's right. He was there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was saying earlier, the borrowed time thing, walking on thin ice. I mean, the fact that on the day he died, they did the photo shoot with Annie Leibovitz with that amazing picture of him naked in the fetal embrace and Yoko fully clothed. And then, of course, he famously said to Annie Leibovitz, "That's our relationship." So all I'm saying is that Peebles thing, you know, I just found like Andy Peebles is a little bit naive to say, well, that means John Lennon was deliriously happy on the strength of 3 hours. I'm not saying that John Lennon was lying, but I'm saying that he was performing. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this. I think what you said earlier, that does it really matter? That's probably the conclusion.
Right.
So perhaps it's just fun or interesting to speculate, really.
Yeah. I mean, there was just a fusillade of excitement on December 8th for him, right? And he's having a really good day. And in the back of his mind, and we don't know this, they're going to finish this song. You know, they are on the verge of mastering the song at Sterling Sound the next day. So in his head, he's talking about a bunch of stuff that is already passed to him because they're working on something bigger.
Yeah. I mean, they already basically had an album done, didn't they? I mean, just basic tracks, the compositions, let's say. You there?
I'm certainly there.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I was nodding in unison.
You were nodding in audio form.
I was, yeah, it was an audio agreement.
Okay. Like I said, I don't want to harp on December the 8th, but just to say that there is that story in one of the books where John says something to Jack Douglas on that last day in the studio, and he says, you know, don't ever repeat this to anyone. I mean, have you ever heard anything about that?
I've heard a lot about it, and it is rife with speculation. My pal Ken Sharp, in his book, which has just been released on an ebook for this year's anniversaries called Starting Over, he has discussion taking place during the conversation that evening about Sid Bernstein.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, yet again, it was in the news trying to get the Beatles to reform. You know, as you know, the money was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That was an issue that was playing out, and that they had grown tired of Sid, and some of the Rascals were recording there, you know, at the record plant, because now they've moved to the record plant. And so that it may have had something to do with that. Others have said that John was sharing something about his relationship with Yoko, or perhaps more death premonitions or what have you. So, you know, that's shrouded in mystery. And, you know, Jack hasn't really shared with us exactly what it is or was, although my understanding from Jack is he's working on a book, and hopefully we'll find out.
Oh, that'd be nice, yeah.
Yeah, but again, you know, just to hammer home what we've been saying over and over again, it exists outside of the music, whatever it is. But, you know, John was clearly having that kind of an evening, right? He also shared a lot of things with Yoko. He was excited about what they'd done, and she thought he was particularly loving that evening too, because to quote John Lennon himself from back on October 9th, 1975, he was higher than the Empire State Building.
He certainly was on that boat, as I was saying, when he was sailing to Bermuda.
Yeah. So I'm just happy for this person whom we've all gotten to know so well over the years that he was having a great day. Good on him.
I don't doubt he was having quite a few good days at that time. My only issue was with this, all his demons were slayed kind of narrative. That's all.
And look, they weren't, right? They weren't at all.
Yeah.
He had told us that as much a couple of times in 79 and 80 in his recorded thoughts. And, like anybody's life, he was always in the process of becoming something else.
Absolutely. Do you like speculating about what he may have done had he lived, or is that boring, or have you got any thoughts on it?
I do think he would be a very active participant, would have been in the numerous social issues that just emerged year after year, and of course culminating in 2020 where we sit right now. And, in my dreamiest place, I would hope that he would have had an impact and maybe created change for the better. But, my rational self knows that change is incremental, and President Obama often quotes MLK, right? That the arc of history is long. So, how much difference it would have made, who knows? But it sure would have been nice to have his voice out there as part of the forces for good. And like you, I wish you'd written a novel. So
yeah, would have been good.
But that's about all I did. I think I have to side with our friend Mark Lewisohn at a certain point that the speculation is problematic because it didn't happen that way, and time's impermanence is unyielding. Yeah. Unless those physicists whom we've trusted all these years finally figure out how to make a viable time machine. Higher ed has had physicists ensconced in its quarters for a couple of 100 years now. Why has that not happened? I'm talking to you physicists. Get out there and get started.
And bring John Lennon back.
Or just,
sharpish.
Make all of these movies and speculative fiction come true and get it together. This is unacceptable. We should do a podcast just on railing against physicists and their inability to meet the challenge.
All right. We'll think about that one. I don't know anything about physics. So
they've had 100 years to respond to H.G. Wells and make his fantastical dreams come true.
As far as what John Lennon would have done, I feel he would have very much embraced grunge. And he would have said immediately, as soon as he heard Nirvana, he would have said, oh, they're doing what we did at the Cavern. Definitely.
Probably so. He liked spare music, music that didn't have too many adornments. But absolutely, I always remind people, his favorite music, bar none, and he loved his ska and reggae in 1980 as much, if not more than everything else. But he always went back to 50s rock and roll.
That's it, rock and roll.
That was his knowledge base. He probably couldn't tell you when the Beatles recorded what song, but he could tell you with encyclopedic precision, what he heard on the Radio Luxembourg in 1956, a rockabilly track he heard or what have you.
I just think when he heard Kurt Cobain scream, if he'd heard Kurt Cobain scream, he would have said, oh, that's the primal scream.
Maybe so.
Definitely, I think, yeah. And I think he would have liked hip hop as well from the sort of activist standpoint. I hope he wouldn't have tried it himself. Okay, this has been fabulous. I don't know, I wasn't apprehensive, but I was worried that some of the stuff I said you might have been sort of vehemently defending the official version of things, but you weren't. So.
No, because we'll never know. And to me, that just is one more reason to do our best with the historical, biographical aspects, and then just nail the music, because it's the only thing that matters.
Right. Okay, excellent. So yeah, just a wholehearted recommendation for your book. John Lennon, 1980, The Last Days in the Life. Is that right?
That's correct.
I had a guest on before and I wholeheartedly recommended their book and then said the title wrong. So I made sure to do that. Oh, the other thing, are you still on Talk More Talk? Have you got like a casual relationship there?
It's scheduled the same night as my work as teacher. And so I can't make every episode, but I'll be there again. I think on October 19th, we're doing a special episode together.
Okay. Unfortunately, this is probably going out in December, so.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Or I might get it out earlier. I'll see how it goes. But you can certainly be found on some back episodes of Talk More Talk, which is on YouTube. So yeah, thanks a lot for doing this. Let's have one final question. What do you think we can learn from John Lennon's life? And not necessarily John Lennon, the superstar, but John Lennon, the guy, even though we didn't know him.
Right. But we felt like we knew him, don't you think?
Definitely,
that's part of it. We really felt like we knew him and had a strong connection with him. I think that can be safely said. So the things I take away are just the rage to try to live authentically, to be like Thoreau and suck the marrow out of life or whatever, however that line goes, and realize that, it's a journey. We're never going to get there, but to not stop trying. We get to enjoy John's story and how he has all of these great moments and accomplishments in the nick of time. And we don't know what our nick of time is. So when I think of him and that experience, I do try to live more deeply.
Yeah, that's it. He was a searcher. I mean, there's a good Elvis Presley documentary in the last couple of years called Elvis the Searcher, and there's a bit of that to him and there's a bit of that to me. And I'm sure there's bits of John Lennon that you identify with, as you said. So what I like is endless curiosity. There's so much that we're never going to know about how the world works, ourselves as well. We're all discovering things about ourselves, I think. So yeah, I just think endless discovery and endless curiosity. We're going to end it on that happy note. So thanks very much and good luck with everything. Have you got another writing project going? Well, I know you have.
Yeah,
inside information.
Yeah, a book with my pal Jason Krupa. We're writing about All Things Must Pass and Layla, those twin albums with similar band members that were recorded for one brief moment at the same time during 1970. It's been really fun getting back into that music.
Okay. All right. Just stay on the line for a second. Thanks very much for doing this and good luck with everything.
You got it. And I will, when I shut it down, I'll send you I'll be sure to send you the audio.
Yeah, and try and get Mark Lewisohn on the show if you can.
Have you tried it?
No, I haven't actually, no.
I bet he would be interested.
Do you reckon?
He's a good sport.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thanks again and bye for now. Talk to you again in the future.
Good weekend.
You too. Bye. So there you have it. That was episode 61 with Ken Womack. As I said, recommend Ken's book. If you haven't read it, I hope it's stimulated some interest. I would say Ken has found, I'm going to say, a middle ground between Coleman and Goldman, but I don't mean that in the way of a safe middle ground. There's stuff in his book that probably a few years ago would have seemed very controversial, but I think, as we've discussed ad infinitum on this podcast, gradually the darker stuff is creeping into, let's say, the mainstream, or let's say a narrative that is generally quite happy. And I think Ken's narrative of John is quite happy. But, as I said to him, I think there were plenty of happy moments for John Lennon in 1980, obviously prior to the tragic event. So there we go. The next episode is the welcome return of Dan Richter. Dan was on the show in July 2019, and he just talked about life with John and Yoko, and we did talk about Stanley Kubrick a bit. I couldn't have possibly had him on without talking about that. This time there's more Kubrick and also John Lennon, about equally I'd say, and we're exploring the concept of genius. I think the word genius is really used a bit too much. It's a bit like the word depression. People will feel sad and say, oh, I'm depressed, and someone will do something good and say, oh, what a genius, or what a genius move that was. But more important, rather than saying, oh, Einstein was and Steve Jobs isn't or whatever, it's more to do with the way they think. And Dan, if you listen to the other show and any of his many interviews and podcasts he's done, he's definitely a thoughtful person, and he got a good insight into the mind of Stanley Kubrick and the mind of John Lennon. So that'll be fun. And this is actually a short outro today. Just to say, please subscribe, share, like, ratings and reviews, as ever, always helpful. iTunes, for example, is a game, as I've said before. It's about trying to get your podcast recognised among, well, probably millions now. I don't know how many podcasts there are out there on iTunes and other platforms, but anything you can do to help the show is much appreciated. And I will see you fairly soon. In fact, the next show is pretty much the 2-year anniversary of Glass Onion. It's already passed in a way, because the first thing I did for the podcast was interview Rod Davis, and that was January 2019. But officially, I put the first episode online on February the 7th, so I might have the one with Dan Richter out by then to celebrate 2 years of Glass Onion. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you very soon. Take care and goodbye.